So I've tried to live my life in a way that, and then, during the divorce, they printed fucking horrible lies, horrible, mean.
For more than a year, Ben Affleck said almost nothing, not to reporters, not on red carpets, not in the string of memes that turn his coffee runs and sad car rides into a running joke about a man quietly falling apart. Jennifer Lopez had already spoken. The tabloids had already built their theories. And Affleck just kept driving, kept working, kept his mouth shut. Then, in the spring of 2025, he finally sat for a cover interview with GQ, and what came out of it wasn't a scandal. It was something stranger, more honest. A grown man admitting that he saw the whole thing coming and walked into it anyway. He didn't blame her. He didn't defend himself. He just tried, for the first time, to explain the truth, and the truth turned out to be far more uncomfortable than any rumor the internet had invented. Every failed celebrity marriage gets the same treatment from the outside world. People want a villain, a betrayal, a single moment where everything cracked. That's the story people expect, because it's a story that's easy to tell. But when Affleck finally addressed his divorce from Jennifer Lopez, he refused to give the public that version of events. He told GQ there was no scandal, no soap opera, no entry behind the collapse of the marriage. And instead of leaving it there, he went further, saying the truth was almost boring compared to what people wanted it to be. That's not the answer of a man protecting a secret. That's the answer of a man who has actually sat with what happened and stopped needing to dress it up. The line that cut through everything, though, was a metaphor he had first used months earlier in Lopez's own documentary, and repeated again for GQ. He said, "You don't marry a ship's captain and then complain that you don't like being out on the water, that you have to own what you knew going in." It's a small sentence, but it does a lot of work. It means Affleck wasn't ambushed by Jennifer Lopez's fame. He wasn't naive about who he was marrying. Long before they exchanged vows in Georgia, he understood exactly what her life looked like from the inside. The cameras, the tours, the album rollouts, the world tuned into her every move. He signed up for that world with his eyes open. And that's what makes this such a different kind of celebrity confession. Most public breakups get explained away with someone playing the wounded party, blindsided by a partner's true nature. Affleck did the opposite. He essentially said, "I knew who she was, I chose this, and I still couldn't sustain it." That's not an accusation against Jennifer Lopez. It's a confession about his own limits. He even clarified, in a follow-up conversation with the same magazine days later, that the ship analogy wasn't meant to explain some deep fracture in the relationship. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was just an honest snapshot of two very different temperaments trying to share one very public life. Affleck has always described himself as more private, a person who is only middlingly comfortable with the machinery of fame even after 3 decades in the business. Lopez, by contrast, has spent her entire adult life building an empire designed to be seen. Music, film, fragrance lines, arena tours, a brand built on visibility. Neither of those approaches to celebrity is wrong. But putting them inside the same marriage means one person is constantly steering toward the spotlight, while the other is quietly looking for the shore. Affleck admitted he knew that tension existed before he ever said, "I do." What he hadn't accounted for was how exhausting it would be to live inside that tension every single day, for years, under a media microscope that never blinked. That's the real weight behind his admission. It's easy to accept a risk in theory. It's much harder to actually carry it. Knowing something intellectually and surviving it emotionally are two completely different things, and Affleck's biggest confession wasn't about Jennifer Lopez at all. It was about discovering, too late, that his own tolerance for that particular storm was smaller than he'd assumed. He wasn't rewriting the story to make himself the victim. He was doing something rarer in Hollywood divorces, taking the blame for his own limitations instead of hers. It's worth remembering that this wasn't the first time these two had tried to build a life together. Affleck and Lopez first got engaged back in 2002, after meeting on the set of film that would go on to become more of a punchline than a hit. That first engagement collapsed in 2004 under a level of tabloid attention that, by today's standards, looks almost primitive. No social media, no camera phones in every pocket, just relentless print coverage and paparazzi stakeouts. They went their separate ways, married other people, raised other families, and by all appearances moved on for good. So when they reconnected in 2021, nearly 2 decades later, it wasn't two young actors stumbling into fame together for the first time. It was two adults, each with a full history of marriages, children, and public scrutiny already behind them, choosing to try again with total knowledge of what they were getting into. That history is exactly why the ship captain line lands so differently coming from Affleck than it would from someone marrying into fame for the first time. He wasn't guessing at what her world might feel like. He had already lived a version of it once, 20 years earlier, and walked back into it anyway, apparently believing that time, maturity, or simple love would be enough to make the second attempt land differently than the first. But if Affleck's words explain his mindset, it was the paperwork, not the interview, that revealed just how deliberate the ending actually was. Words can be softened, interviews can be rehearsed, but a court filing doesn't lie about timing, and the timing of Jennifer Lopez's divorce filing said something Affleck's interview never directly touched. On August 20th, 2024, Lopez walked into Los Angeles County Superior Court and filed to end the marriage. That date wasn't random. It was the exact 2-year anniversary of their formal wedding ceremony at Affleck's Georgia estate, the big, traditional celebration that followed their spontaneous elopement in Las Vegas a month earlier. Filing on that specific day, according to reporting at the time, was widely read as anything but coincidental. What makes the timing even more telling is what the documents revealed underneath the surface. Lopez listed their date of separation as April 26, 2024, nearly 4 months before she actually filed. That means the marriage had already quietly ended in practice while the public was still watching them out at dinners, still speculating over solo red carpet appearances, still trying to read tea leaves in every paparazzi photo. She let the summer pass. She let the rumors build. And then, precisely on the anniversary of the day they stood in front of their families and promised forever, she made it official. Compare that to how the relationship began. The Las Vegas wedding in July of 2022 was fast and famously spontaneous. The kind of impulsive, all-in gesture that made headlines because it felt so unlike typical Hollywood planning. A month later came the version everyone actually saw. The sprawling, romantic ceremony in Georgia, surrounded by both of their children from previous relationships, presented the world as the real beginning of Bennifer 2.0. Choosing the anniversary of that specific day to end things wasn't just administrative. It closed the loop on the exact image the couple had spent 2 years building. There's another detail buried in the filing that says just as much about how quickly and how completely this relationship had been built on hope rather than caution. There was no prenuptial agreement. None. That means everything either of them earned during the marriage, production deals, endorsement contracts, music royalties, brand partnerships, was legally treated as shared property, subject to negotiation the moment the divorce became real. Two people with decades of experience in the entertainment industry, both of whom had been through public breakups before, chose not to protect their individual finances going in. That's not carelessness. That's belief. They weren't hedging their bets. They went into the marriage the same way Affleck described his GQ interview, fully, deliberately, without a safety net, which makes the ending even harder to read as anything other than a serious, considered decision rather than an impulsive escape. Filing for divorce is, legally speaking, a routine act. Thousands of people do it every year, without anyone reading meaning into the date on the form. But when the person filing is one of the most closely watched celebrities on the planet, and the date happens to land precisely on the anniversary of the ceremony the world watched her plan for months, it stops being administrative. It becomes a statement. Lopez didn't need to say a single word to the press. The paperwork did the talking for her. The build-up to that filing had been unfolding in plain sight for months before it became official, which is part of why the eventual date felt less like a surprise and more like an inevitability. In May of 2024, Lopez walked the Met Gala red carpet alone, without Affleck by her side for the first time in years of joint appearances, and the internet immediately treated it as a signal. Around the same time, she quietly canceled a planned summer concert tour, citing a need to focus on her family, a decision that only fueled more speculation given the timing. Affleck, meanwhile, had reportedly moved out of the sprawling marital estate the couple had purchased together and into a rental property of his own. None of that was confirmed as divorce-related in the moment, but looking back at it after August 20th, the pattern is hard to miss. The public didn't get blindsided by the filings so much as watch the pieces quietly fall into place for months before anyone made it official. Affleck's interview came 7 months after that filing, which means by the time he was finally explaining his side of the story to GQ, Lopez had already spent months processing the fallout in public, and she'd done it long before he ever sat down for that cover shoot. Long before Ben Affleck used the word quotidian to describe the end of his marriage, Jennifer Lopez had already described the same collapse in far more visceral terms. In October of 2024, she sat down with comedian Nikki Glazer for a profile in Interview magazine, and what came out of that conversation was raw in a way celebrity interviews rarely are. Lopez told Glazer that her whole world had exploded that year and called the period the hardest stretch of her life. This wasn't a polished PR soundbite. It was someone describing in real time what it feels like when a very public dream falls apart in front of an audience of millions. The context makes it land even harder. Just months before the divorce filing, Lopez had released an entire album, a musical film, and a documentary, all built around her love story with Affleck, all framed as proof that this second chance at a relationship they'd first started 20 years earlier was a real thing. She had put her belief in that marriage into her art, released it to the world, and then watched the relationship end almost immediately after. Talking to Glazer, she admitted she felt like she finally had everything figured out, only for it to fall apart in a way she never expected. What's striking is what she said came out of that collapse. Lopez told Glazer she'd realized she didn't need another person to feel complete, a lesson, she said half-joking, had taken her 30 years to actually learn. She said she wasn't looking for anybody, that she needed to prove to herself she could stand on her own after a lifetime of moving from one serious relationship into the next. That's a very different emotional posture than Affleck's later interview. He was explaining a mismatch of temperaments, almost academically. She was describing something closer to grief. Fear, sadness, and a disorienting work of rebuilding an identity that had just been very publicly shattered. That gap in timing matters. Lopez did her emotional reckoning out loud in October, while the wound was still fresh. Affleck didn't offer his own version of events until the following March, 5 months later, once he had the distance to frame it calmly. By the time he was calling their split quotidian, Lopez had already lived through the explosion, processed in front of an audience, and started building whatever came next. He got to explain the mechanics after the dust had settled. She had to survive the blast in real time, with cameras pointed at her the entire way through. That's the part of the story that rarely gets attention, because it's less dramatic than a fight or a betrayal. Two people can experience the identical ending of the same relationship on completely different timelines, feeling completely different things, and both versions can be true at once. Lopez's explosion and Affleck's admission weren't contradictory. They were simply two people processing the same loss at two different speeds, one moving through in the open in real time, the other needing months of silence before he could put it into words at all. So by the spring of 2025, the emotional groundwork had already been laid. Lopez had said her piece. Affleck had said his. What nobody expected was what happened just weeks later, when Affleck stepped in front of cameras again, and instead of staying guarded, said something that seemed to contradict everything the ship captain metaphor implied. 3 weeks is not a long time. But 3 weeks after telling GQ he couldn't sustain a life inside Jennifer Lopez's level of fame, Ben Affleck stood on a red carpet at the premiere of The Accountant 2 and told a reporter from Entertainment Tonight that Jennifer Lopez is spectacular. He didn't stop there. He said she's wonderful with his kids and that the two of them have maintained a genuinely good relationship since the divorce. For a media cycle that had spent a year hunting for signs of bitterness between the two of them, this was not the quote anyone was braced for. At first glance, it might look like a contradiction. The same man who had just explained why he couldn't handle her world, now publicly gushing about her. But that reading misses the point entirely. Affleck wasn't backtracking on anything he told GQ. He was drawing a line that had been implied the whole time, but never stated outright. The difference between loving someone and being able to live inside the environment that surrounds them. He never said Jennifer Lopez was the problem. He said the water was too much for him. Those are two very different statements, and the red carpet comment was him finally making that distinction impossible to miss. The setting mattered too. All 5 of their children, Lopez's twins and Affleck's 3 kids from his marriage to Jennifer Garner, were there together, supporting the film as a blended family unit. That image alone said more than any quote could. A year after the divorce filing, after all the tabloid speculation about who said what to whom, here was a group of children standing shoulder to shoulder with 2 parents who had clearly decided the marriage might be over. But the family wasn't going anywhere. This is, frankly, a rarer outcome in high-profile divorces than people tend to assume. The instinct in a lot of celebrity splits is to control the narrative by controlling the story, leaking details, taking sides through anonymous sources, letting the public pick a hero and a villain. Affleck and Lopez did something closer to the opposite. He praised her character publicly. She continued speaking about him with respect in her own interviews. Neither one used the kids or the cameras as leverage against the other. Whatever tension existed in the marriage clearly didn't extend into how they chose to handle its aftermath. There's also a practical dimension to why this mattered. Every unkind word either of them said publicly would become a headline, then a talking point, then fuel for months of further speculation. By refusing to give the tabloid machine anything to work with, no shade, no subtext, no score settling, both of them effectively starred the story of Oxygen. Affleck calling her spectacular wasn't just gracious. It was strategic in the healthiest sense. A decision to protect 5 children from watching their parent perform a public war neither of them actually wanted to fight. Still, praising an ex-wife on a red carpet is one thing. What came next suggested Affleck's GQ interview wasn't just an update for the public. It was meant to be the final word. According to a source who spoke to People magazine after the GQ profile ran, Affleck's interview wasn't a casual check-in with the press. It was described as a deliberate, final attempt to clear the air on the subject once and for all, with the understanding that, going forward, he simply doesn't plan to discuss Jennifer Lopez publicly again. That framing changes how the entire interview should be read. It wasn't an update. It was closure, delivered on his own terms, so that he wouldn't have to keep answering the same question for years to come. Look at the full sequence of events, and the logic becomes obvious. Affleck admitted, calmly and without malice, that he understood the risks of marrying someone with Jennifer Lopez's level of fame, and admitted his own temperament ultimately wasn't built to sustain it long term. Lopez, months earlier, had already described the emotional aftermath of that same realization in far rawer terms, calling it the hardest period of her life before finding her footing again. And then on a red carpet with all 5 kids present, both of them showed the public what the relationship actually looked like after the dust settled. Respectful, protective, and entirely uninterested in assigning blame. Once all 3 of those pieces were on the record, there was genuinely nothing left to explain. What stands out most, according to that same source, is that Affleck isn't walking away from this feeling proud of how things turned out. There's no framing of the divorce as a win, no sense of vindication in his silence. It's described as more of a quiet acceptance that the marriage didn't work, paired with a decision to stop letting that failure define how he spends his time. Instead of continuing to explain himself to a press cycle that would never really be satisfied, he chose to redirect his energy toward the people who actually depend on him, his kids and his work. That decision to go quiet is, in its own way, the most telling admission of the entire saga. Affleck has been famous for over 3 decades. He knows exactly how these cycles work, how one comment gets clipped, recontextualized, and turned into a headline that spawns another round of questions. The only real way to stop that cycle is to stop feeding it. By saying his piece clearly, praising his ex-wife's character without hesitation, and then closing the subject for good, he took away the one thing tabloid coverage depends on: new material. No follow-up quotes. No leaked tension. Just silence and the quiet work of raising 5 kids across 2 households that have, by every visible measure, chosen peace over spectacle. Strip away the headlines and the anonymous sources, and what's left is a surprisingly simple, very human story. Ben Affleck married someone whose life was built for a level of visibility he knew, going in, he wasn't naturally suited for. He didn't get blindsided. He made a choice, tried to live inside it, and eventually admitted, calmly, without blaming her, that he couldn't sustain it the way he'd hoped. Jennifer Lopez, on the other hand, lived through the collapse of that choice in real time, in the middle of releasing an album and a documentary built entirely around their relationship, and had to rebuild her sense of self while the entire world watched her do it. Neither version of events needs the other to be wrong. That's what makes this particular Hollywood breakup different from the usual formula. There was no smoking gun, no third party, no single betrayal anyone can point to. Just two people whose approaches to fame were fundamentally different, who loved each other enough to try anyway, and who eventually recognized that trying wasn't the same as sustaining. Affleck said as much himself. The real reason for a breakup is almost always more ordinary than the story people want to tell about it. What happened after the split says just as much as what happened during the marriage. A red carpet full of blended family members. Public praise instead of public warfare. A deliberate decision on both sides to protect their kids from becoming collateral damage in a media narrative neither of them controls. That's not nothing. In an industry that often treats divorce as another chapter to monetize, choosing quiet respect over public conflict is its own kind of statement. There's a version of this story where either of them could have chosen differently at almost every turn. Lopez could have filed on an unremarkable Tuesday instead of the anniversary, and no one would have read anything into it. Affleck could have stayed silent indefinitely, letting the tabloids fill the void with their own theories the way they had for a full year already. Either of them could have used a single red carpet moment to plant a seed of blame, and the entire narrative would have shifted into the kind of bitter, drawn-out war the public has come to expect from famous divorces. Instead, at nearly every fork in the road, both of them chose a quieter, more deliberate path, one that protected their kids, preserved whatever respect still existed between them, and refused to hand the tabloid machine the ammunition it was clearly hoping for. So when Affleck finally admitted at 53, what a lot of people had already suspected, that he knew exactly what he was signing up for, and simply couldn't carry it the way he'd hoped, it wasn't a confession of a man exposing a secret. It was the admission of someone finally comfortable enough to stop performing certainty he never actually had. He got on the ship, knowing the water would be rough. He just didn't know how long he could stay afloat. And maybe that's the most honest way to look back on the entire saga, not as a cautionary tale about celebrity marriages, but as a reminder that even people who think they understand exactly what they're walking into can still be surprised by how heavy it feels once they're actually carrying it. Do you think he should have stuck it out, or was walking away, carefully, respectfully, without a single bad word about her, actually the harder and more honest choice? Let us know which moment in the Bennifer story you think really marked the turning point.